Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. Today we're going to wrap up our conversation about World War II by talking more explicitly about the war in the Pacific. We're going to get into some of the challenges that the United States faced, and then ultimately we are going to talk about the ending of World War II in today's video. So, we're, of course, looking at one of the more iconic photographs taken in U.S. history, and there's, of course, some debate on whether or not it was staged or if it was just caught in the moment. But either way, it describes a moment in U.S. history of great strength, and certainly in this case, specifically the U.S. Marine Corps being able to capture the island of Iwo Jima as part of, again, the Pacific theater in World War II. So just to kind of get our bearings, physical geography, where are we at? We're going to start certainly looking at, we'll get into Guam today, we'll get into the Philippines, we'll certainly talk a little bit about of course, come back to the importance of Pearl Harbor, we'll talk about the Battle of Midway a little bit, and certainly with this primary target of the mainland of Japan, and certainly, of course, ending with Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the use of the atomic bomb. So, on the same day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, again, one of those dates that I think you should know from U.S. history, is December 7th, 1941. And the Japanese bombers, on the same day, again, on December 7th, they're also going to strike the airfields in the Philippines, along with the islands of Wake and Guam. Wake being located here, Guam being here, and of course the Philippines being located here. These are all key American bases in the Pacific, wanting to deal this massive blow all at once. And again, these actions are ultimately what brought the U.S. into the war, and specifically this theater of the war in the Pacific. So, American General Douglas MacArthur, he's going to employ his Filipino and American troops. Remember, the Philippines at this point are still a protectorate of the United States. They're going to try to defend the Philippines, and they're going to be forced to retreat to the Baton Peninsula. And they're going to be specifically in the small island fortress of Corregidor. And it's here that they're going to try to hold off the Japanese till backup can come. Unfortunately, the Allied troops, after months of intense fighting, they're going to be forced to surrender. You're going to see, American, Filipino. There's probably also some British troops present here, maybe even some Australian troops. Certainly would have been fighting along with the United States. And you're going to see that they're going to be forced on this devastating march, what's called the Baton Death March. Basically, along the way, the Japanese are going to beat the POWs, and many of them are going to die, dehydration, physical abuse, and some just executed on their way to a Japanese POW camp. And certainly one of the examples from World War II of these really attacks against the humanity, and certainly described as, along with the Holocaust and certainly some of the treatment of people in the gulags, just these crimes against humanity. This is from a survivor of the Baton death marches. And he says, "We'd march all day, a continuous plodding along, just trying to keep up. I always tried to stay in the middle of the column rather than on the flanks. That way, I was further away, and I might avoid a beating. I don't know how to explain a typical day except that it was brutal, exhausting, hot, and your feet and legs just ached." And so, we can see through some of the events of World War II that there is a little bit of that loss in humanity and how we treat our common man. And so certainly out of World War II comes certainly some more specific ways in which soldiers, POWs, and civilians need to be treated moving forward. And that'll come through the United Nations. Japan also, there were several reports about experiments being done on American POWs in these camps, whether it was, different methods of torture. It's believed that maybe even some seeing the effects of some poisons and other things on the human body, similar to, unfortunately, what we would have seen probably, maybe to a lesser degree, but similar to what we would have seen in the Nazi concentration camps. But again, probably not to the same extent. So right now, especially after that, morale for the Allies is low in the Pacific. And so they need a shot in the arm. They need a little bit of a boost. And that's where James Doolittle comes in. His bombing raids against Tokyo, and then the American victory at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Both of those are going to help improve that morale, help push forward this much needed morale boost as we get further into the war with the Pacific. We'll talk a little bit more with my students in class as far as what this bombing was and certainly what its effects were. But we've got this quote about the Doolittle raids that talk a little bit about how the physical damage done to Japan was negligible. It didn't do a whole lot. But the psychological side of it, the impact was truly significant on both sides of the Pacific. So while it didn't do a lot to affect the war effort, psychologically, Japan knew that they could be attacked in their capital. And so it provided a boost for the Americans, but it created some fear for the Japanese. And so, again, while it wasn't a huge battle win or massively destruction, it gave that morale boost that we talked about. The Navy is also going to destroy 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and hundreds of planes during a very key victory at the Battle of Midway. This is a battle that the U.S. Air Force truly gets to shine. In their tactics and through their dogfighting, they're really able to win a very decisive battle. And again, the Battle of Midway being right here, not far north in the Tropic of Cancer. And in class, we'll talk a little bit too more, and certainly we've got a cool video too that talks a little bit about the importance of this battle. But again, this is what those Midway Islands would look like as we get closer to today. And just to see some of the damage done that day and certainly its impact. Now, MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz are both through land forces, through the infantry, and then through the Navy. They're going to adopt this strategy that we call island hopping. Basically, the strategy involves attacking an island, capturing the island, and being strategic about what islands you take. You bring your base to that island, then you use that as your headquarters to then leap to the next island. And so you're slowly making your way closer and closer to the mainland of Japan, which is your primary target. And along the way, certainly also you're seeing China fighting alongside the United States and reclaiming some of their territory, including places like Manchuria. You've got the Australians, you've got the Philippines, and certainly Britain would have been to a smaller degree involved here in the war in the Pacific as well. American forces, again, they're going to meet a lot of resistance. One thing we know about the Japanese is that surrender was considered to be dishonorable. And that, again, kind of flows back from samurai traditions, and that it was better to die in battle than it was to surrender. But also the idea that when the military was going to be done fighting, the civilians would pick up the fighting from there. And so they meet a lot of resistance. And when they're fighting for control of the Guadalcanal, the Americans are going to see that resistance, and they're going to see, again, this is not going to be easy, and that the Americans finally are able to secure this island in February. Again, secured meaning gaining control. They're going to gain that here, not that far off the coast of Australia, we would have actually used Australia as a base for part of these operations. That happens in February of 1943. Americans then are going to make their way first to Guam, along with the neighboring islands, and this is going to be done in June of 1944. Again, reclaiming that territory after it had been a protectorate of the United States. From there, you're going to see American ships destroyed most of the Japanese fleet at what we call the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and Leyte Gulf takes place in is located in the Philippines, and at that battle and takes place in October of 1944. So again, representing the U.S. reclaiming some of those territories that had been lost in the fighting early on with Japan. So again, reclaiming Guam, reclaiming the Philippines, again, both which would have been protectorates of the United States. So the goal here is, again, we're making our way towards the mainland of Japan. And of course, you're going to see, certainly, we've got a couple of key areas that we need to take first. So using the Mariana Islands, the U.S. is going to make its way to the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Both of these are going to prove to be very challenging battles, especially Iwo Jima. And when you look at kind of the physical geography, whether it's from, this overhead view or even kind of from a side view, you're going to see as the soldiers, especially like Iwo Jima, marched, they're already at a disadvantage because the Japanese control the high ground and there's no shelter here. There's nothing to guard the Americans, and the only way to go was essentially to go forward. And you can see from the kind of this topographical map, again, elevation is going to be a massive advantage for the Marines as they land here along the eastern part of the island of Iwo Jima. So this is from Norm Elam, and it's a description of what he saw as he entered into the battle at Iwo Jima. I want to take a moment to read this. It says, when we got to shore and our Higgins boats were turning to back up to the shore to let us off, it seemed that the world exploded. Every rocket launcher, mortar, and gun on the island must have been aimed towards us. The air in front of us was filled with bullets. Some of the boats didn't make it to shore, others did, and the ramp was quickly lowered. I ran off the ramp, and about 20 feet or so from the shoreline, I threw myself to the ground. The beach ahead of me was clean and smooth. There was not a rock, a tree, or a blade of grass to cover from the storm of bullets and shells. The only logical place to be was back in the boat. But looking back, I could see that the boats that were capable of moving were speeding away from shore already, and the shoreline was already red from blood, and there were bodies floating in the water, and the only way left to go was forward. And so it's a very monumental task of trying to capture these islands. And again, they met extremely fierce resistance. And it's at Iwo Jima that you see finally, once the United States does occupy the island, that you saw the raising of the flag. Now, like I said at the beginning of the video, some people believe this is a staged photograph. Others think that it was just captured in the moment. But either way, it symbolizes, in particular, for the Marine Corps, one of their proudest moments. And certainly, again, it's one of the most iconic photographs in American history. And you can see that flag if you go to the Marines Museum in Quantico, which I highly recommend you do. And I know that 8th graders at our school, as part of their Gettysburg and Washington, D.C. trip, one of the places you stop at is in Quantico. And so if you get the chance, it's an amazing museum. Please go check it out. So coming back to that tradition in Japan of not surrendering and it being better to die in battle, partially through desperation, partially through tradition, it was seen that if you were going to go down, you should take out as much of the enemy as possible. And so the Japanese were unleashing suicide pilots, essentially. And these pilots were known as kamikazes. And these were Japanese suicide pilots who basically had the mission of take down as much of the enemy as possible, and then before you go down, crash into your target. And so this adds a whole nother layer of difficulty for American ships as they essentially try to remain safe and keeping an eye on these. And again, these kamikaze pilots did massive amounts of damage. So the U.S. bombers, especially as they're making their way towards Tokyo, they're going to begin in Guam. You're going to see the attacks beginning here. From here, they're going to pick up more planes in Tinian as well as Saipan. And then from there, the B-29s are going to drop firebombs on Tokyo. And when this happens, it lit up the city in just flames. And you can see from pictures like this one, just the massive amount of damage that was done to Tokyo. And you can see, ranging from, 24% to, like in Tokyo being 40 up to in Toyama up to 99% of the area was destroyed by these firefighting. And so, again, dealing huge blows to the Japanese mainland. But we do know, though, that Japan, despite facing this superior force and almost certain defeat, that the Japanese are going to continue to fight. They're going to continue to train civilians. They're going to continue to train women, even children to some extent, to make sure that the fighting continued. And it should be noted that future President John F. Kennedy fights in the Pacific in World War II. And when he sees the way the Japanese continued to fight, despite a superior force, despite superior military, he really credits that with the decision-making that he makes in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, his experience with the massive loss in the Soviet Union during World War II is partially what he credits with his decision-making in this same time period. And ultimately, the experience of World War II is going to help to define future events between the Soviet Union and the United States, those two being great examples. Now, with all this going on, Roosevelt's going to create a top secret operation called the Manhattan Project. And the idea here is to create a weapon of essentially mass destruction, and to what's going to be called the first atomic bomb, a weapon that hopefully would end the war more quickly. Now, we've talked already about FDR passing away as his fourth term begins, and President Truman taking office has a really important decision to make. Is he going to decide to use the atomic bomb as a military weapon, or does he potentially risk invading Japan with potentially hundreds of thousands more dying between civilians in Japan and soldiers on both the Japanese and the American side? And he believed that it was his duty to try to save American lives. And so he chose to use the atomic bomb. Now, the Allies do give another ultimatum. They issue what's called the Potsdam Declaration, warning essentially that if Japan didn't surrender, that they would face what they called prompt and utter destruction. Again, the use of the atomic bomb. Again, Japan does not know what's coming. So ultimately deciding to use the atomic bomb to end the war more quickly, the crew of the Enola Gay are going to be responsible for dropping those atomic bombs. And that crew, again, probably not knowing exactly what they were carrying, they followed orders. And so on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. And 3 days later, they dropped a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. So August 9th, 1945. And it's going to deal a massive amount of damage. You're going to see, of course, the famed mushroom cloud that gets created from atomic weapons, or in today's standards, nuclear weapons. It just led to utter destruction of most of the buildings and the physical infrastructure of these cities. It also did a lot of damage to the people of Japan, including a lot of physical damage from the explosions, but the radiation is probably where the most damage is done. For years afterwards, almost generations afterwards, you're going to see, due to the radiation exposure, you're going to see increased rates of cancer and birth defects. And there are still some places in Japan that they recommend that you don't go due to radiation levels, especially in the mountains. In Hiroshima alone, between 80,000 and 120,000 people were killed. And Nagasaki, that number is somewhere probably between 35 and 74,000 people. So there's a massive amount of damage done. What we have to try to weigh as we think about this decision is, of course, what's the future impact of nuclear weapons, but also perhaps try to understand why Truman made this decision, because these numbers most certainly would have been much larger had the United States decided to invade the mainland of Japan. And we knew that Japan was not going to surrender basically until Tokyo was taken. And again, that would have been a major uphill battle. But I invite you to come to your own conclusions. There's no right answer here. There's a lot of what ifs in history when it comes to that decision. Japan ultimately surrenders August 15th, 1945. This becomes known as VJ Day, much like we'd had VE Day. VJ Day, again, meaning victory over Japan. And when we look back, World War II was the most destructive conflict in our history. And up to this point still is. There were more than 55 million people lost, killed during this particular event. Again, either in battle, in civilians lost during fights, or again, to prison camps, to the gulags, to the concentration camps. And when we look at the U.S. in particular, that number is around 322,000 dead, with about 800 injured as a result of the war. And these are high. These are certainly high numbers, but when you compare them to other nations, they're actually fairly low. Some of the biggest, and these, when I should say with casualties here, this is again another estimate for those who died. And again, these figures aren't perfect, but we estimate probably 22 million casualties on the Soviet side. Massive amount of death. Again, on the Eastern Front, it's the Soviets. There's nobody else fighting alongside them. In Germany, that number is probably a little over 4 million, 4.2. In Japan, it's about 2,350,000. For Romania, that number was about 460,000. And then again, for the United States, we estimate that number somewhere around 400,000. Again, probably closer to about that 322,000. But certainly this is, again, just puts into perspective where the U.S. is in comparison to other nations. All right. That is going to wrap up our look into World War II. So for my students, please make sure you ask any questions if you have any. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History.